In these discourses, we're following the origin and evolution of an ancient gathering of planets close to the Earth. The formation stretched across the ancient sky, but is no longer present. The planetary assembly was witnessed around the world, and amongst its evolutionary phases, we've listed a condition called the polar configuration. The defining feature of this phase was the alignment of the Earth's rotational axis to that of the gathered planets. We've identified the gathered planets as the source of the mythic archetypes now documented within all of the well-developed early cultures. In their underlying integrity, these archetypes could not exist without the natural events that inspired them. The primary constituents of the polar configuration can be reliably named thanks to well-established astronomical traditions. The large sphere is the planet Saturn, the discharging star close to the center of Saturn as the planet Venus, and the smaller reddish sphere in front of Venus as the planet Mars. It was the collapse of that final form that ended the myth-making epoch as the gods departed to become distant stars, more specifically the respective planets as we observe them today. Even if in many lands the planetary connection was lost in the chaos and reorganization of the solar system that followed, the global pattern, the archetype, was not lost. And that archetype can be reconstructed through systematic comparative analysis. This is why the rules of cross-cultural investigation are essential. Separate fragments of evidence are effectively useless when disconnected from larger patterns. And as the larger patterns are brought to light, it is also essential that they be followed back to their first occurrences, where the records themselves are closest to the original human experience. The arrival of this crescent was a widely celebrated event. It meant the beginning of a daily cycle, which the myth makers themselves designated as the coming of the first day and night. For any reliable interpretation, the reference must be considered in their archetypal, original, and testable contexts. As you follow these discourses, you can assess this testability for yourself as we continue surveying the entire panorama of ancient myths, symbols, and sacred practices. The most critical themes are, firstly, an original, undifferentiated condition or absence of form, and secondly, an emerging geometry of creation with specific regions above and below, and thirdly, a central role of the archetypal warrior hero as the cosmic pillar personified, filling the role of the demiurge, a primeval power executing a divine or intelligent plan. Thus, the role of the cosmic warrior was paramount. The separation of above and below was, in fact, the warrior god's first achievement, even before he had earned his title as warrior god. In recent episodes of this series, we've reviewed the mythic ship of heaven, a vehicle of the ancient sun god. Close to the Earth, a crescent on the face of the immense planet Saturn turned in the polar sky, brightening and dimming in an archaic daily cycle. Ancient words and symbols for this cycle invariably reflect the symmetrical opposition of the crescent in its contrasting phases. A phase of growing bright and a phase of growing dim. Crescent to the left and crescent to the right. Crescent above or below, all in explicit connection to a daily cycle with no counterpart in any celestial behavior observed today. And this unique behavior, by its specificity, gives us an ideal opening to the ancient myth of the heavenly twins. It seems that every well-documented culture preserved memories of the primeval twins, but few researchers appear to have noticed the underlying unity of this theme. The closer we can get to the more archaic cultural expressions, the more clearly the improbable unity will stand out. Some of the particulars are long familiar. Astrologically, the cosmic twins find their most popular expression in the constellation of Gemini. Of course, the story itself is never explained, and the constellation is just one of numerous echoes of the global archetype in later times. But what inspired the original idea? In our reconstruction of the ancient sky, the answer comes from the fundamental role of the rotating crescent, reflected in the strategic placement and unique gestures of the cosmic twins around a central figure. And we see the same geometry in the two faces of the ancient god himself. By far the most data comes from the Egyptian symbolism expressing the mirror-like aspects of the crescent in the concept of the symbolic Ka, usually translated as a double. But why was the Ka hieroglyph simply a pair of arms? Our explanation is that the crescent form, when seen behind the polar column that is so fundamental to this reconstruction, readily provoked an imaginative interpretation as two arms or wings. In fact, the Egyptian Ka symbol was the perfect expression of the twin-like aspect of the crescent, one position in the daily cycle appearing as a mirror or twin of the opposite position. Upright arms in the phase of growing bright, inverted arms in the phase of dimming. The concept of a double in the sense of a mirror image could not be more appropriate. The symbolism is abundantly evident in iconography of the Phoenician goddess Tanit. In ancient Egypt, the concept also found expression in the oppositely placed twin goddesses Isis and Nephthys in mirror positions to the left and right of the central sun god Ra, or one of his mythic counterparts. This connection to the enclosing crescent will explain why the arms or hands of the twin goddesses so frequently displayed an enclosing aspect in relationship to the king. When paired as twins, divine figures represented the two halves of the celestial kingdom, marked out by a revolving crescent in its daily circuit. In the pyramid text, the king declares, "Isis is before me, Nephthys is behind me." Or the two mistresses of Buto accompany you to the right and left. Or alternatively, the king declares that the goddess Neith is behind me and Selket is before me. Again, nothing in natural experience today will account for the pervasive imagery. The twin aspects of the giant sphere of Saturn came to identify that sphere as the vast womb of creation itself. O you two who conceived Ra, you shall give birth to me. The two great ladies, Isis and Nephthys, bore you. My mother is Isis, my nurse is Nephthys. The king ascends upon the thighs of Isis, the king climbs upon the thighs of Nephthys. Elsewhere, in imitation of Ra, the deceased king aspires to shine between the two thighs of Nut. Keep in mind that these roles of goddess figures placed into the service of crescent symbolism must not be confused with the role of the planet Venus, the prototypical goddess, in our reconstruction, a quite different topic discussed earlier with much more discussion to follow. Our point here is that the cosmic twins find a persuasive explanation in the twin-like aspects of the revolving crescent. For example, the crescent is the image of a cosmic ship. See that connection in the identification of the sun god's boat with the cosmic twins comes as no surprise at all. The twins Isis and Nephthys were named the two boats. Or alternately, the Egyptians invoked the two boats as Atet and Sektet. Atet, the descending boat of growing strong, was linked to the left side of the primeval sun, as we would expect, while the ascending Sektet boat, meaning growing weak, was linked to the right side. These twin aspects of the revolving crescent give us a key to the larger panorama of Egyptian symbolism. For the Egyptians, the position of the crescent above and below marked out two regions called the two Aterts. Chapter 141 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead identifies the upper Atert with inactivity or dimness, usually mistranslated as the region of the night ship, but literally meaning the ship in its phase of dimming or growing weak at the top of its circuit. Conversely, the texts connect the so-called day ship, literally the ship of brightness, with the lower Atert, all in perfect harmony with the symbolism we've already noted in our previous discourses. Right and left, above and below, are the essential qualities of the cosmic twins. For example, in Egypt we see the aspects above and below in the symbolic pairing of the figures Nut and Geb. The goddess signified the upper region, and the male half, the lower portion of the circuit, was defined by the male power Geb, denoting also the twin peaks of Akhet, the world mountain. Together, the two mythic images meant the unity of the celestial domain, considered as the prototypes of Egypt, the two lands, upper and lower, seen as a copy on earth of the divine plan first displayed in the sky. The idea was stated emphatically by Henry Frankfurt in his groundbreaking book, Kingship and the Gods. The so-called two lands of Egypt, he said, reflected the original order of creation itself. Indeed, every primary interpretation of the revolving crescent was predictably linked to the dualities of above and below, or left and right. It was not just as a pair of outstretched arms that we see the twin roles of the crescent, upright in the phase of growing bright and inverted in the phase of growing dim, and not just in the symbolism of the cosmic ship. We've seen the same symbolism of the archaic day and night in oppositely or symmetrically positioned horns, and most incongruously the upright and inverted twin peaks of heaven. In all instances, the upright and inverted forms express precisely the same connections to the phases of the daily cycle. The most fundamental fact about the cosmic twins is that they are not just twins, but they surround and enclose a venerated god or king or central star, confirmed by simply observing how the symmetrically placed arms or arms and wings so frequently enclose and protect the king. Amongst the most famous of primeval twins were the Greek Dioscuri, who, according to the leading expert A.B. Cook, represented two halves of a celestial circuit. Here we see the Dioscuri in a pose directing us to ancient symbolism of two enclosing arms about a central orb or star or divine figure. Since the cosmic twins are mirror images of each other, it's not surprising that the Greeks retained the connection by placing the central star and the two Dioscuri on a mirror. In mythic terms, the contrasting twin-like positions of the illuminated crescent were the two faces of the primeval power Janus, giving rise to the so-called Janiform countenance. Thus, Ioannis the Lydian describes the ancient celebrants honoring the god Janus on the first day of January, his month, dressed up in a two-faced mask, and people call him Saturnus, identifying him with Kronos, the Greek god of Saturn. Of course, the entire idea can only appear absurd, but from the vantage point of our reconstruction, it is the predictable, the inescapable astronomical connection. And by this reasoning from ancient facts, we acquire a starting point for a new and radical interpretation of the cosmic twins, a subject to which we'll return after laying further ground on the visual dynamics of the polar configuration.
A mythic archetype is a broadly distributed pattern of ancient storytelling and magical reenactment. In
In the past century, cross-cultural studies have identified hundreds of archetypes, and our own study has added many themes to the list.
According to ancient Greek poets, philosophers, and historians, the present age is just a shadow of the former epoch called the Golden Age of Kronos. But who was this ancient god, Kronos? All Greek astronomical traditions agreed that Kronos was the planet Saturn. Our own name for the planets came from the Romans. In unison, Roman poets and historians insisted that in a former time Saturn had ruled as a god-king, producing a paradise on earth. It would be almost impossible to overstate the power of this memory among the different cultures. For the Babylonians, the Hebrews, and the Greeks, the most sacred day of the week was the Sabbath, a ritual remembrance of the lost epoch. And in each of these cultures, this holiest day was the day of Saturn, the Latin Saturnidis, or Saturn's Day, the Celtic day of Seater, our Saturday. A worldwide tradition says that before a king ever ruled on earth, a prototype of kings arose in heaven. Father of kings, model of the good king, the universal monarch. The Aztec Quetzalcoatl, the Egyptian Ra, the Hindu Brahma. Every culture had its own universal monarch. It is said that the local king is responsible for the prosperity of the nation. In the reign of a good king, the earth flowers abundantly. Why is this? It is because the universal monarch, who set the standards of kingship, brought forth a remarkable condition in primeval times, an epoch called the Golden Age. Sunrise, to the star worshippers, a symbol of the cosmic dawn, when the universal monarch, the first sun god, shone above the world. The ancient Greeks called their sun god Helios. We assume they were referring to the sun we know, the sun that rises in the east and sets in the west. But in the earliest Greek manuscripts, Helios was the name of the planet Saturn. And the Greeks were not alone. The Babylonian Shamash, always translated as sun, was identified as Saturn. So also the Egyptian Ra, the Hindu Surya, the Latin Sol. But Saturn is a mere dot in a starry expanse. What could have caused the first star worshippers to celebrate that minute speck as the sun? Every day our sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But the archaic sun god Saturn did not rise or set. It did not move. Egyptian texts say of the sun god Atum or Ra, the great god lives fixed in the middle of the sky. Surprisingly, the Babylonians used almost exactly the same language to describe the sun god Shamash in the stationary center of heaven. For an earthbound observer, there is only one motionless spot in the sky, the celestial pole. The stars we see are actually cutting a circle around the polar axis, close to the star Polaris. Of course, nothing would seem more irrational than an ancient sun god at this location. And yet, throughout the Near East, the universal monarch appears as a central sun called the axis and the pole of the world. To the Hindus, the sun god Surya occupied the place of supreme rest. So too the Greek Helios and the Aztec Quetzalcoatl. In their earliest expressions, these figures occupy the stationary cosmic center. There is an astonishing unity to this global tradition. Ancient Iranian astronomers identified the pole as Saturn's home, and so did the Neoplatonists of Greece. Roman poets remembered Saturn as the steadfast star, and Chinese astronomers recalled that, in the beginning, Saturn was the arch premier at the celestial pole. On every continent, archaeologists have uncovered curious drawings of an archaic sun. They do not look like our sun, yet they are strangely similar. And most mysterious of all is the great crescent encircling the sphere of this enigmatic sun. Early Egyptian drawings place crescent horns on the sun god Ra. In Mesopotamia, the crescent is repeatedly drawn wrapped around the sun god Shamash. Crescent horn turning in the sky. The image appears throughout the world. A vast crescent, unlike anything in our own sky today.
The history and origins of the gas giant Saturn, and indeed the entire solar system, including our own planet, is not what we've been told. Planetary scientists recently made the astonishing discovery that water in Saturn's satellites and rings is remarkably similar to water on Earth. As Thornhill explained, this discovery was explicitly predicted nearly 3/4 of a century ago by the scientific heretic Dr. Immanuel Velikovsky. It was Velikovsky's claim that only a few thousand years ago, a period of chaos reigned in the solar system. One of the planets closely associated with Earth was Saturn, and watery filaments rained on our planet following Saturn's violent flare-up. Decades later, based on the respective research of Dave Talbot and Eduardo Cardona, Thornhill developed his own model of a primordially close relationship between Earth and Saturn, which was the source of all the water in our oceans, while leaving remnants in its rings. Today, Thornhill continues his presentation, shifting his focus to his own successful predictions for the Saturnian system, including the mysterious moon Titan.
Before I tell the epic story, a warning. Our education systems train students to memorize a litany of facts, which produces global groupthink. Students are not given the time or encouragement to critically examine the history of ideas. A leading researcher into the learning functions of the divided brain, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, has shown such blinkered left hemisphere training renders students functionally blind to alternative ways of looking at a problem. The left hemisphere simply blocks out everything that doesn't fit with its take. It doesn't see it, actually, at all. So scientists with their narrow specialized training may look at but cannot see what to a non-expert may seem obvious. They will be the last to see a paradigm shift in the making. This is particularly evident for electrical phenomena in space. Even the Nobel Prize-winning founder of the idea of an electric universe, Hans Epstein, was ignored when he warned in his 1970 acceptance speech of an inevitable crisis in astrophysics if electric circuits in space are not recognized. Houston, we still have that problem after almost 50 years. I have lived since a teenager with uncertainty about accepted truths and learned to have the courage to challenge them. The result is not chaos, but a synthesis of ideas that explains the old ideas better and finds new ways of incorporating what seems a chaos of anomalies. And the best test is that of classical physics, simplification. The resulting paradigm shift is not a threat, but an invitation to the greatest adventure we may ever know, to begin to understand our real place in the universe for the first time. In our electric universe, stars and planets are formed at the same time inside molecular clouds, along a snaking cosmic lightning bolt. Gravity plays no role in the process. Since cosmic lightning takes the form of a twisted pair of current filaments, it is found that most stars are in pairs, or multiples. Planets will tend to do the same. Like the snaking filaments in a novelty plasma ball, the star-forming filament moves on, leaving a string of massive objects behind to gravitationally form the weird and theoretically challenging zoo of exoplanetary systems recently discovered. Some gas giant planets are subsequently formed in close orbits about a star that has ejected charged matter to achieve stability with a changed electrical environment. The ejection flares may account for the flickering of newborn stars, which can't be explained by gravitational accretion. This explains the unexpected hot Jupiters seen in large numbers closely orbiting other stars. The most numerous stars in the galaxy, brown dwarfs, which would appear reddish if they could be seen with the naked eye, are generally classed as failed stars, yet they have the baffling ability to produce massive stellar flares. This is simply explained because red stars don't have the ability of main-sequence bright stars to control their current by a transistor-like action in their photospheric plasma. A brown dwarf can only respond by discharging matter electrically. The capture process of a brown dwarf star involves flaring and ejection of charged matter by that body in order to achieve a new electrical equilibrium in its adopted family. That accounts for the large number of close-orbiting moons of our captured gas giants in remote orbits. With this in mind, I want to take you back to just before the famous Cassini-Huygens space probe was to arrive at Saturn on July 1, 2004. In news reports, Saturn was dubbed the original Lord of the Rings. There is a profound truth behind such a glib turn of phrase, but it wasn't until the advent of the telescope that Christian Huygens in 1656 was able to suggest that Saturn had a ring. So how do we explain the Saturnian ring symbolism that pervades our cultures? The halo of the saints, the royal crown, and the ring given in marriage are Saturnian symbols, as are the circled or Celtic cross, the Egyptian Ansate cross or Ankh, the Eye of Ra, and the astronomically baffling star inside the crescent. The star at the top of the lighted Christmas tree is pure Saturnian imagery. It is truly amazing that we are still haunted by prehistoric archetypes. It helps us to understand the extraordinary archetypal attraction of Tolkien's fantasy of Lord of the Rings. He was well versed in mythology. The following description of events is based on the surprisingly detailed and truly remarkable scholarship of Talbot and Cardona, which required explanations with the physics of an electric universe. Let's call our primordial star Proto-Saturn. It was an independent brown dwarf with its own entourage of satellites, including the Earth, Mars, and Titan. Proto-Saturn's dim reddish light was due to a glowing red anode plasma sheath, much larger than the Sun, enclosing Proto-Saturn and its inner satellites in a radiant cell. The term dwarf star is purely theoretical, since they are difficult to see and measure. In fact, NASA reported a brown dwarf which was radiating as if it had twice the expected surface area. The environment inside the radiant red shell is most hospitable for life on any enclosed satellites, because there are no seasons, and water is conspicuous in the spectra of such stars. Water misted down on this planet continually, and red light is ideal for photosynthesis, which explains the abundance of ferns and other vegetation globally in the Carboniferous era. But there is a catch. Brown dwarf stars are known to flare, sometimes to the extent, as one astronomer commented, that any satellites would suffer a very bad day. Such flaring by Proto-Saturn accounts for the geological strata and the fossil record of a number of global mass extinctions and instant burial of dismembered plant and animal remains. As we approached the Sun from deep space, our plasma sheath flickered like a faulty electric light when the two stellar plasma sheaths, or magnetospheres, began to clash. Proto-Saturn's galactic electrical power was usurped by the Sun, and its appearance changed dramatically. Before dimming forever, the dwarf star Proto-Saturn would have flared brilliantly like a comet, ejecting charged matter to relieve the electrical stresses caused by the sudden change in environment. Even now the former star has not completely cooled. Saturn still radiates more than twice the heat it receives from the Sun.